The HOA shut off the residents' water, not knowing that Michael controlled the entire water supply system. He cut off the water to the HOA office and smirked. Your own rules. But what happened next changed everything. The heat pressed down like a scorching iron plate. Michael Brooks stood in the kitchen, staring at the dry, shiny metal of the faucet. Not a drop. He turned the handle harder, trying to force it, but only a hiss of air came from the pipes, a mocking reminder that the water was gone. He ran a hand across his sweaty forehead. The air conditioner struggled against the heat, while outside the temperature had climbed to 104 degrees. Lakeview was always hot in the summer, but today the air was stagnant, heavy like a concrete slab, pressing against his lungs, making it hard to breathe. A water supply issue? A pipe burst? A pump failure? Michael stepped toward the window. Down the street, neighbors were already emerging from their homes, peeking out their doors with confused and angry faces. Some of them held the exact same letters as the one he had just pulled from his mailbox. A sense of dread passed through him as he tore open the envelope. The HOA logo stood out instantly, and in that moment, rage ignited. Dear Mr. Brooks, due to an outstanding balance of $1,500, your access to utilities has been suspended. Water service will be restored upon full payment of the amount. His eyes narrowed. What outstanding balance? He had always paid on time. His finances were flawless. This was just another excuse to squeeze more money out of him. Michael crushed the letter in his fist. The HOA had already been bleeding. Residents dry with ridiculous fines for the wrong shade of fence paint, for grass that was allegedly a few inches too tall, but cutting off water. In this heat, this wasn't just extortion, this was cruelty. Residents were gathering in their yards, waving their letters, arguing loudly. "What the hell?" someone shouted. "I paid all my bills on time." "They can't do this," an elderly woman protested, wiping sweat from her face. "We have kids. Are they insane?" A man in a tank top and shorts tore up his letter in fury, clenching his fists. Michael looked at their angry, sweat-drenched faces and knew he wasn't alone. The HOA had targeted the entire neighborhood, and he knew exactly who was behind it. Deborah Miller, the HOA president, a woman in her 50s, always dressed in expensive suits, with flawless hair and a smug smile. She had a gift. She could sound like a caring friend while twisting your arm behind your back. She always got what she wanted. She loved power. She hated those who challenged her. And today, Michael realized one thing. She had gone too far. Michael wasn't walking. He was storming. Every cell in his body burned with fury, and the sweltering air only fed his rage. His skin was sticky with sweat, his shirt darkened with moisture, but he barely noticed. He marched past the HOA's lush, manicured courtyard, a green oasis in the middle of a scorched desert. The lawns were pristine, the fountain bubbling cheerfully, the office's air conditioners humming as they kept everything inside nice and cool. Everything the residents paid for was used to keep the HOA comfortable, not them. He pushed open the glass doors. Inside, the atmosphere was chilled and sterile. White walls, fake plants, expensive furniture. In the corner, a clerk in a business suit casually made himself a coffee. A middle-aged woman at the reception desk sat eating an apple, not even bothering to look at him. They were enjoying their comfort, while the entire neighborhood suffered without water. Michael stepped forward sharply, heading straight for Deborah Miller's office. The door was slightly open, and through the gap, he could see her spacious, impeccably organized workspace. At the center, behind a massive oak desk, sat Deborah herself. Her cream-colored suit was flawless, her dark hair perfectly styled. In waves, and in her hand, a glass of ice water, condensation sliding slowly down the sides. She lifted her gaze lazily, as if just now noticing him. The room was pleasantly cool. A small fan on her desk gently stirred the air, and through the open window, the soft murmur of the office fountain drifted in. "How can I help you, Mr. Brooks?" Her voice was smooth, almost sweet, but beneath it lay a cold, amused mockery. Michael silently threw the crumpled letter onto her desk. "You cut off the entire neighborhood's water." Deborah looked at him the way one might look at a child complaining about a lost toy. She tilted her head slightly, pretending to examine the papers. "No, Mr. Brooks," she said lightly. "We only cut it off for those who haven't paid their fees." His fists clenched. "I have no outstanding balances." Deborah sighed, theatrically, flipping open a folder and skimming the pages. "Perhaps you forgot to pay a fine for, let's say, your grass height, or maybe your trash bin wasn't positioned at the correct angle." She lifted her eyes to him and smiled, cold, hollow, like a car salesman trying to sell a wrecked vehicle. "Ah, yes. Here it is. Last Tuesday, your trash bin was placed 10 inches outside the approved pickup zone. That's a $500 fine, and of course, late fees." Michael felt the heat rising to his temples. "Are you kidding me?" Deborah shrugged. "The HOA has the right to suspend utilities. Want your water back? Pay up." Michael's knuckles turned white as his fingernails dug into his palms. Beyond the glass doors, the crowd outside was growing. Residents stood in the blazing sun, waving their letters, shouting, arguing. Some were calling lawyers, some were fighting with security, some were desperately holding up empty water bottles. But Deborah didn't care. She turned her chair toward the window, watching the pristine office courtyard, with satisfaction. "You could always move." Those words were the final straw. Deborah Miller always saw herself as the ruler of Lakeview. She ran the neighborhood like a medieval lord, clutching money, rules, and power in her hands. She decided who deserved a smile and who would be crushed under a pile of fines. No one could challenge her. But there was one thing she didn't know. Michael owned the entire water supply. A few years ago, when the previous owner of the water utility company decided to sell, Michael, a seasoned investor, bought it at a bargain price. The HOA never bothered looking into utility contracts, believing they controlled everything. But in reality, he did. The HOA thought they could shut off water whenever they wanted. But today, they found out what it felt like to be without it. Michael didn't shut off the entire neighborhood's water. He did something better. He cut off water to the HOA office. The air conditioners fell silent, leaving the staff trapped in thick, stifling heat. The water coolers ran dry, leaving behind nothing but empty plastic jugs. The toilets stopped flushing, and soon a sharp, unpleasant smell filled the office. The heat quickly turned the building into an oven. The walls, cool that morning, now radiated like hot metal. Sweat poured down employees' faces, their white shirts darkening with moisture, their skin flushed red from the overwhelming heat. By noon, Deborah had enough. She stormed into Michael's water company office, waving her arms as if she could disperse the sweltering air. Her perfectly styled hair was now a mess, her makeup had melted, and her cream-colored suit was soaked with sweat. "What the hell?" Her voice was hoarse from thirst and rage. "We have no water." Michael, sitting calmly at his desk, slowly looked up. Unlike her, he looked fresh and relaxed. A fan gently cooled his face, and a glass of ice-cold water sat on his desk. He picked it up, took a slow sip, and smirked. "Really?" He raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like you have an outstanding balance. HOA hasn't paid its water bill. Deborah blinked. That's ridiculous. We've always paid on time. Have you? Michael casually flipped through some papers, turned a page, and pointed to the numbers. Well, according to this, you owe... He paused, enjoying the moment. $15,000. Deborah gasped in outrage. This is blackmail. No, this is policy. Your policy, Deborah. She glared at him, but Michael only shrugged. Pay up, and you'll get your water back. Silence. A look of realization flickered across her face. She understood. He had beaten her. The next day, the HOA office looked like a besieged fortress. The air conditioners still weren't working. The water coolers were still empty. Employees sat in their offices in sweat-soaked shirts, waving folders desperately, trying to create even a hint of a breeze. Frustration hung thick in the air, but no one had it worse than Deborah Miller. When she walked into Michael's office, she was nearly unrecognizable. No more perfect curls. Her hair was plastered to her forehead, tangled from the humidity. No more flawless makeup. It had smudged, leaving dark streaks under her eyes. No more smug smile. Her lips were pressed into a hard line, and her chin quivered with rage and humiliation. Fine. Her voice was hoarse, dry. She wiped her forehead with a shaking hand. We're dropping all the fines. The water will be restored to the residents. Michael, still sitting comfortably, slowly nodded. Good. He paused, as if something was missing. Then he leaned forward and added, But I have one more condition. The HOA will never interfere with the water supply again. Deborah looked up. Her pupils dilated, and her lips trembled. You can't demand that. I can. She swallowed hard, staring at the papers in front of her. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the pen. Sign it. For a moment, it seemed like she might refuse, that she might try to cling to her last shred of control. But the heat, the thirst, the pressure from the residents, the angry complaints from employees suffering in the office without water, it had broken her. She signed. The document that forever stripped the HOA of its power over the water supply was now official. A few hours later, water flowed back into every home. The sound of rushing water filled the pipes, and neighbors ran into the streets, cheering, turning on their faucets, filling their glasses, pouring water over themselves, relishing the moment. The HOA couldn't control them anymore. Deborah stood in the office doorway, watching the celebration. She knew she had lost. Michael stepped onto his porch. Residents gathered around, some clapping him on the back, others thanking him, while some simply enjoyed the justice that had finally been served. He lifted his head and smiled. No one should let the system control them. We decide how we live. The crowd roared in approval. Someone shouted, That's how you deal with the HOA. Michael cast one last glance at the HOA building. Behind the window, Deborah stood motionless. Her face was empty, lifeless, stripped of all power. She knew. Her reign was over, and that was the real victory.